Okay, so I got about, I don't even know, 20 words here to talk about, and they're all have to do with blank. So the first one's leading, which is what I mentioned in the last. You know what? We're going to say number one. I mentioned this in the last kind of video, but leading is the person who is, we have my little people here. Lead climbing is the one who's going up and actually placing quick draws on the way up and clipping the rope into it. If someone was to be on top rope, so the rope's already running through the anchor, that wouldn't be considered leading. Leading, they have to be at the very least clipping the rope into the draws. So if the draws are up there already, that's still considered leading, but it just means that they actually are bringing up the rope with them. It's not pre-rigged up there. So that's what leading is. Seconding, appropriately, is number two. Seconding is usually a term reserved for the person who's going up without placing the rope in. So someone has already gone up, set up all the gear, and seconding can either be used in a lead scenario where someone has already went up and set all the climbs, but where I hear it get used more is in a top rope scenario, a top belay scenario. So usually seconding is someone who comes up and meets the next person and they're seconding the route. But you can also, I guess, use it in a single pitch context. Usually it would just say top roping, though, if they were going up with a pre-rigged rope. We're going to say short roping. So while the climber is climbing up, the belayer is going to have to feed out rope to them so that they can clip draws. So say I'm the climber, I get here, I'm going to clip a draw. It wouldn't look like this, it would look like just a bolt. But say I clip there, and then I'm going to take rope and clip it into here. But as I pull up this rope, there's lots of extra rope that's needed. So if I pick it up and there's not enough rope in the system, that can be considered short roping. But the other thing that can be considered short roping is if I'm just climbing and then I can't move up anymore, I get tugged backwards because the belayer hasn't fed out enough rope. So say I'm climbing here, there's a rope between these two people, and I can't go up anymore because the person on the ground hasn't fed up enough rope. So importantly, the belayer's job is to make sure there's enough slack in the system, so enough extra rope that the person who's climbing is able to move freely without getting tugged down by the rope. And when that does happen, when it does get tugged down, whether that's while moving or clipping, it's called short roping. Importantly, short roping when you're clipping, it happens. Sometimes it's kind of unavoidable because you don't see that they're going for the clip. We'll get into that later, but you can actually make people fall, and I've actually made people fall and been pulled off the wall because I make a move and there's not enough slack in the system, and then I get pulled back. So short roping sucks. Good belayers avoid short roping, and that's what it means. 4. Slack. So we already mentioned this. Slack is used in two ways. So slack is the definition of the extra rope between these people. So say it's my belayer. I don't really want to put rope on here because I don't know where I'm going to move these guys around. But if there's a loop of slack, if there's slack, say my climber is up here. You know what? I'm going to throw it up just to show you. So if my climber is climbing, slack is what we use to define the rope that's in the system between it being tensioned and not. So say my climber was super tight here. I'm like pulling in all the rope I can. There would be no slack in the system. And then if I drop some more rope, now there's slack in the system. So the rope itself is slack. This word is also used for communication. Usually from the climber, we'll yell this down. If they yell slack, that means they want rope being given out to them. So it both defines, this is what slack is. This would be a lot of slack in the system. This would be a tiny bit of slack. And if you hear the climber yell slack, what that means is they want you to give out rope to them. We'll talk about giving out rope later, but that is what that means. Might as well talk about this one now. It's kind of the opposite. So take. Take is what a climber will express to the belayer to say they want all of the rope to be taken in. So you're trying to take, as in pull rope into your belay device. And usually this means they're about to fall or they're about to weight the rope on purpose. There's lots of scenarios that might ask for this. But the word take is kind of the opposite of slack. Importantly, when you're communicating, you don't really want to mix those words up. So a lot of newer climbers will go take in all the slack or too much slack. And when you're climbing, like you can imagine, if this person's way up here and they're yelling, take in all the slack, and all the belayer hears is slack, now they're just going to dump out rope, right? So it's important when you're saying one of these two words, especially in an environment where it's hard to hear, that you're extremely clear about which one you're saying. And now we're going to say hard catch. So a hard catch. So when someone is climbing, if they fall, try and show you guys an example here. Okay. So now I have my little fake climber. Hopefully you guys can see this. So if my climber is below the bolt and climbing, I can just keep them quite snug on the rope. And if they fall, they just fall a few inches. If there's a lot of rope in the system, there's more stretch. So they're going to fall a bit further. But there's not much force on the climber if they're below the bolt, if you're belaying right, because you have them quite tensioned. Where it gets crazy, I'm actually going to move this down. Is when the climber is above the bolt. So you can imagine if the climber is above the bolt, this might get loud for a moment. Well, that didn't work because the ground is too close. If the climber is above the bolt and falls, and I don't do anything, then all of the force is going to go into them, and the only dynamicness is the rope stretch, which in this scenario, there's barely any rope stretch. Now, something you can do to limit the amount of force on the body is you can do a little hop. So as they fall, You jump right as they're weighting the rope. Kind of hard to show here, but that's going to soften their fall. Now, it's important here you consider the weight difference between yourself and the other climber, because if someone weighs like 100 pounds and you weigh 150, then they're just going to get pulled up anyway and kind of offset that. And without them even jumping, it's going to reduce the force. If it's the opposite way around, if you're weighing like 150 or more and the climber's 100, then you're going to have to jump a lot to make sure that they don't get whipped into the wall. So one, you get force on the body when you land in the harness, and two, it can kind of slam your feet into the wall. And I know people who have taken pretty bad hits where they just fall and they don't get a soft enough catch and they really injure their foot or ankle because they just slam into the wall so hard. The exception here is if you are close to the ground, sometimes you'd rather have a hard catch usually than actually impact the ground. So you have to keep your wits about you and just kind of do the math for the climber and make sure that you're not jumping and letting them hit the ground or a ledge. But that's what a hard catch is. Probably talk about that more later too. Okay. Just trying to think. The next one is clipping. So this is another one that's kind of more communication based. When a climber is actually climbing, as I said, sometimes they might be higher up the route, might not be able to see them that well. Just going to take this out because it's not really an anchor here for our example. Okay. So they would be tied in, but you can imagine sometimes when they clip, they're going to yell clipping, and that means they're going to be taking rope out to clip it. And usually this would be communicated in a scenario where they're clipping above them, because you need to give out a lot more slack when they're clipping above them. So if you hear the word clipping, what they're basically saying is, give me slack because I'm about to clip high and I don't want to get short roped. So that's what clipping means. Some people also yell clipped or like clip when they do it, and that way you can take them nice and snug because you know you're underneath them. But most often, the one that I hear most often is just clipping. Also, if you're not paying attention as a belayer, then it's a moment where you can be like, oh shit, I should be watching them, even though you should be vigilant the whole time. Okay, clipping. Now, the other word is falling, which is always a fun one if you have to say it. So when we get into how I belay later, we'll talk about falling. But falling basically means that usually you say it when you're above a bolt, but you can say it when you're at the bolt or under it too. It's just indicating, the climber will say it to indicate it to the belayer that they're about to fall. So they'd yell falling, and then the belayer can get ready, whether that means ready to jump, whether it means, taking in all the slack because they're under the bolt. Highly dependent on the context, but falling is just like, hey, I'm going to fall right now. And that's said if you just know you're going to fall. Pretty simple. Watch me. Watch me is kind of what you usually hear before falling. Maybe this is just in my climbing group and culture, but I've definitely seen people in lots of different areas say this. And it basically means I'm going to try a really hard move here and I might take a fall. So it's like this is a low chance move or low probability move, we would call it. And there's a potential for me falling here. So just stay vigilant and keep your eyes on me. That's what watch me means. It's there's a high, not a high, but there's a chance of me falling right now. I'll move up here now. 10, climbing. try and put quotation marks around the things that people say. So climbing. So sometimes you'll take a fall and you'll be sitting on the rope, and usually the belayer, I mean, if you're sitting on the rope hanging out for like 2-3 minutes, they're not just watching you intensely the whole time. They'll like rest their neck, look around, do whatever they do. Generally it's good etiquette to say climbing, or like I'm gonna climb now, or I like to say like climbing in 3, 2, 1. That way they know, because usually they're sitting back on the rope, and if you just start climbing, they might fall or stumble. Whereas if you just yell climbing, it means like I'm gonna go on the rock now. One, they probably won't fall or stumble as much, and two, they can start to give you some rope and make sure that they're not short roping you, especially if you're like right at the bolt. If you don't yell climbing, you just start going, they're obviously not going to be giving out slack. So that's why that one is important to say for both parties. So ready to lower. When the climber gets to the top, they're going to set up the anchor. Usually this is just 2 opposite and opposed quick draws. I have a whole anchor lesson in the community if you're in the community. But the point is they build an anchor, and then they're going to say ready to lower when they're ready to be lowered down. Um, one of the reasons I was told that we use this is because it's 3 syllables or 5 syllables, whatever. Ready to lower. It's a lot of syllables, whereas take and slack kind of sound different. So when you hear that, even if they're over a corner or around a ledge or something, it's quite distinct, like ready to lower, and then you can slowly start lowering them down until they're in sight, and then you can lower them the speed you want. But this is an important one. And then what I do, because sometimes it gets busy at crags, and this is actually for any of the things you're yelling. When it gets busy or there's people climbing beside me, I try to incorporate my belayer's name into it. So if I'm yelling one of these things, I'm going to yell, Kevin, take, or like, Kevin, watch me, just so people aren't confused, because sometimes people's voices sound the same. So that's that. Ready to lower. Okay. This one is going to be interesting. So I'm going to say on ground comms or communication. When you're both on the ground, and gyms actually teach you like certain words sometimes. Depending who you ask, they'll say like you need to say this before you go rock climbing or before you start climbing. Honestly, outdoors, there's no rules. There's people who just tie in and start going for it. Some people say, are you on belay? I'm on belay, ready to climb, climbing, that sort of thing. So some people have their own system. And honestly, with each one of my partners, I kind of have a different ritual before I start climbing. But at the very least, the important thing is you're communicating with each other before you start climbing. And this isn't a term, but I always check for 3 things on the climber and the belayer. For the belayer, I'm checking that they're clipped to the right, the correct loop, which is this colored one called the belay loop, in the correct orientation. I'll just show you. Correct orientation, especially for lead climbing. When you're top rope belaying, it's a lot easier to put it in correct. But when you're lead belaying, it's a little harder to determine sometimes which one the climber end is. So 1, it's clipped into the belay loop correct. 2, it's locked. And 3, the orientation is correct. And I do that by looking. This would be tied into my climber. I look at him or her, and then I'll show them that. So that's for the belayer. And then on the climber, I'm looking at their knot is going through 2 points, the 2 hard points. It's tied correctly, and then there's enough tail, which enough tail to me is just a fist's worth. Some people also include on that checking that the harness is done up correctly, that it's double back through, especially for newer climbers, kind of with older gear, haven't put on harnesses a lot. Sometimes they might put on the harness wrong. But having some form of communication, even if it's just like a nod before climbing, is what I would recommend. And that just prevents you from starting to climb, and your belayer like doesn't even realize you're climbing yet, and he's over there eating his granola bar while you're freaking out. So on ground communication, build your own. A typical one would be like, am I good to climb? And they might say climb on. Whatever the heck you want. I think that's kind of cheesy. Sometimes I say on rock, and then they say rock on. That's what I used to do back in the day. Okay, next one. Let me check the camera's still running. Yep, we're going for it. On ground comms. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about multi-pitch stuff here. So kind of these next, what do we got here? 3 are kind of more for multi-pitching. So one is secure. And I'm just including these because you might hear them. I don't use secure in single pitch climbing unless I'm rappelling off an anchor, which I never do, pretty much. But this would be said in multi-pitching when people get up to the anchor and then they secure their personal anchor to it. So like I said, I don't use this in single pitch climbing because even if I'm personal anchored in, they're going to keep me on belay. But if I say secure in a multi-pitch scenario, the next step is they're going to take me off belay. So usually someone would go up and then they will say secure once they've personal anchored themselves into like a redundant point. Then the next belayer will take them off belay and yell off belay. Now, really important you're careful here because there have been multiple people who have died because their partner took them off belay and they didn't realize that was happening. So in single pitch climbing, it's like, don't ever take me off belay. But in multi-pitching, it's kind of learn multi-pitching on like a course or with experienced people. But generally this word was said, secure, and then they go off belay. That's coming from down here. And then you'd pull up all the rope, have a system set up here to top belay. And then you'd say on belay. And then they would actually say climbing. And since we're talking about comms, these 4 steps, if you can't hear your partner, then you have to know the next steps in the system to know what's next. Like, for example, if you were just single pitch climbing and you think that they've been climbing for long enough that they got to the top, the rope length looks like that, they've been tensioned on the rope for a while, then you can kind of assume that they're ready to be lowered. And I would just slowly start lowering them and making sure there's still tension on the rope until I could see or hear them again. Because you know that's the next step of what's going to be happening. Same thing in the multi-pitching. In multi-pitching, though, we communicate by doing 3 pulls. So if we know the climber's going to get up there and be secure, I would do pull, hold for 2 seconds, let go for 2 seconds, pull, hold for 2 seconds, let go, and then do that a third time, 2 seconds, 2 seconds, because it's very hard for that to happen naturally in climbing. So if I do that, then it communicates to my partner, or you just bring radios. I've went up with radios before. That's also super legit and honestly probably way safer. Yeah, okay, so that's communication. Okay. Part 4, this is the money one.